Hello and welcome to another edition of The Tigers Down Under. I'm your host, as always, Alex, and with me tonight I have Logan.
Good evening, everybody.
And it's sadly another unfortunate result on the road against Stoke, and it's a similar scoreline to last week, another 3-1 defeat away from home, this time to Stoke, which is quite a disappointing result when Stoke was really a game that we looked at as quite a winnable game, and certainly once we'd conceded that opening goal, we did sort of settle into it and dominate for large patches of that game. And when we got the equaliser, it really gave us a chance to go on with it. But ultimately, a pretty disappointing result.
Certainly. I think that given the hype before the match, talking about the three away games that we had left, Stoke was probably the one that we targeted as our most likely opportunity to at least pick up a point, but hopefully three. And so to come away on the side of a somewhat of a thrashing, although if you watch the game, it obviously didn't pan out as tough as the scoreline suggests that it did. But again, another away trip and another 3 points dropped. It's very disappointing and certainly a cause for concern when you see the remaining fixtures and the fact that we probably are going to need to take some points on the road if we are to stay up.
Yeah, Shaqiri's late goal really did sort of put that gloss on the scoreline from Stoke's perspective, and it was quite frustrating, I guess, Crouch getting that header goal, but moments before that, or a few minutes before that, Jakupovic had pulled off a tremendous save, I think might have been from Walters. They were looking quite dangerous after they made those two substitutions, and I guess it was a bit unfortunate with the manner of the defeat, but we did dominate for portions of that game, and Maguire stepped up and had another absolutely outstanding performance.
Yeah, certainly. I think that all the hype in the last few weeks about Harry Maguire it certainly hasn't been unfounded. He's played out of his skin and seems to be standing up probably more than a lot of the other players, and seems to be our kind of linchpin in as far as everything that we do. Going to see him score again is just testament to how well he is going at the moment.
One player who seems to be struggling to score away from home is Niasse, and there was a lot of criticism surrounding him when he came to the club that's certainly been proven unfounded to the extent that Everton supporters saying he wasn't fit to be a Premier League player, etc., etc. But there were glimpses in this game where I think there was a challenge that he sort of pulled out of where he could have tested the keeper a bit more, and certainly a couple of chances that echoed that pretty decent chance he had against Man City last week. So it's a few kind of accumulating now that it might be a bit of a cause for concern regarding Niasse.
Well, I think Omar Niasse has proven himself to be a very quality player, but I think that probably the more alarming thing is just how much of a confidence player he is. When he's at the KCOM, he seems to be able to be really calm and collected, and just showed that with his finishing and as well as his work rate. But certainly enjoys playing in front of the home crowd. When he goes away from home, you definitely see, a larger element of nervousness to his game, and just doesn't seem to have that cool presence that he does when he is in front of the Tigers faithful.
And then what were your thoughts on the team as a whole? We obviously tried to play a 4-4-2 formation, or a 4-5-1 formation, I suppose, with Maguire at right back, which, I mean, we'd already seen against Bournemouth that wasn't necessarily the best position for him. But I guess in the absence of El Abdellaoui and kind of losing confidence in El Mohammadi, it seemed as if that was basically Silva's only option, unless, as I suspected might have made more sense, maybe we could have switched to a 3-5-2. But I guess that would have meant having Krzyzewski or Markovic as a right wing back, which might not have suited either of them. How did you see the team as a whole?
Yeah, we certainly touched on it last week about the kind of what formation Silva would go with, and we ummed and ahed. And I think that it's probably proven now that trying to play three of our centre-backs in Maguire, Ranocchia and Dawson on the field at the same time, albeit Davies, if he's the man that comes into the fold, just doesn't seem to have worked for us. In the past, under Bruce, we have had some joy with those three centre-backs on the field at the same time. But I think that Harry Maguire certainly being out wide is not the option. And I think that we certainly in the first 10 minutes showed our defensive frailties, having too many of the same players on the field, if you like. And it just, once again, just shows that yearning for the return of Moses Otabajo.
Absolutely, and it was interesting that I believe El Mohammadi was our only arguably defensive cover on the bench because Davies again didn't even make the bench. And it was interesting, I think it was for the first goal that Dawson really looked a bit exposed as Arnautovic got through on goal. And it's a bit concerning that in recent weeks we've sort of seen the undoing of both Davies and Dawson to an extent. And hopefully it's just whether it's just coming back into some form after their injuries and they might settle into the team a bit better. But I guess in some ways it makes it a bit easier. We had that conundrum a little while ago that with forfeit centre backs, who were the two who were going to miss out. Davies and Dawson are certainly making it a bit easier to make the case for just starting Maguire and Ranocchia, but it would be a lot better if we could see Davies and Dawson returning to some top form.
Yeah, that's exactly right. And I guess trying to return to form, given the heat of this situation, knowing that we are deep in a relegation fight. I think, as you mentioned, Alex, the Maguire and Ranocchia are by far and away the two that are standing up as our two most safe options to fill that centre back role. And yeah, it's certainly not the time for Dawson and Davies to be struggling to regain form, if you will. So I think that if Maguire and Ranocchia are fit for the remaining games in the run in, they'll be the two that we'll see featuring.
And I guess on the flip side, Swansea lost at home to Watford, so as it almost feels like that run-in 2012-13, funnily enough against Watford, who we face next week, that it almost felt like we just had to match their results. And with Swansea losing to Watford, it did mitigate the damage by losing to Stoke to an extent. But I mean, as I put forward last week on the podcast, if we'd been able to open up a 5-point gap, that would have been huge. So it really did feel like an opportunity lost, but at the same time, it didn't feel like there was any damage done.
No, certainly not. But I had this gut feeling this week that I think that Swansea, given the magnitude of the situation and the kind of question marks over their form and attitude, I know that it was widely publicised in England this week that Swansea were a team that didn't even look like they were in a relegation fight because their attitude just didn't reflect that. And with that kind of criticism that's been offered, I'd be very surprised to see them not come out and put a huge effort in front of their home fans this weekend. And I really fancy them for the cash against Stoke.
Well, yeah, it's certainly very interesting. I mean, I'd seen reports similarly from their supporters who said that their body language, even before the game started, was just a team that was accepting defeat and accepting relegation. And I think after the game, Fabianski looked very isolated and dejected, sitting by the goalpost. So it's quite strange to see such body language and such emotion from the players when it's 2 points. And as you say, if they do go out and beat Stoke on the weekend, as they may well do, if we're unable to put Watford away, then all of a sudden they're back outside the relegation zone. So it's still a very close run race, and it's certainly got a lot of twists and turns to go. And as we often say, I mean, as it is the way with Hull City, it's never done easily, and I'm sure it'll go right down to the wire. And if we are to stay up, it certainly won't be comfortably, and it certainly won't be with 2 or 3 games to spare.
No, certainly not. And I think that the kind of stutterings that Swansea are experiencing is the only thing that has really invited us well and truly back into the relegation scrap. Yes, our home form has been excellent, but it's had to be. But on the road, it just has to be concerning that everywhere we go, even now with Southampton and Palace as our 2 remaining away games, they still don't look like they're kind of options that we could come and take some points. So it's going to be very interesting. But I think that at one of those games, we're going to have to find at least a point if we are to do it.
Well, one player that we're going to hope is to stay fit to prove vital in our fight to stay up is Harry Maguire, and he's our player of the week. And what a week to have him as our player of the week, and it's been one that's been deserved and coming for a while now. He signed for us from Sheffield United for £2.5 million back in the same summer that we signed Andy Robertson, and they've had sort of different trajectories into the City team, with Robertson getting a place in the side straight away, but Maguire obviously having to contend with another signing that summer in Michael Dawson, as well as Curtis Davies, who was still showing quite good form in the side, as well as Alex Bruce, Paul McShane, who were playing quite well as well, as senior centre-backs ahead of him. He went out on loan that season to Wigan for half a season, and the Wigan fans, I'm pretty sure, had pretty raving reviews about him. So he always seemed the sort of player who, if given the opportunity, was going to play pretty well for us. And I think we saw that in glimpses when he played for us that season. But he really came into his own once we were relegated and got a run of games in the championship. And I think it was around the turn of the year in December, January, where he had a run of games in the team. And suddenly we went on this pretty tremendous winning run, and I think was sitting first on the table for a while. And of course, he had that famous tackle against QPR where he took out two players with one tackle, and he really started to get that sort of cult status about him, especially towards the end of the season. But it's really under Silva that he's come into his own and really, he's almost our first pick. I mean, he pretty much is our first choice centre back at the moment, which is pretty remarkable considering you've got an Italian international next to him in Ranocchia. You've got Dawson, a former England international, who's almost being forced out of the side, as we were just discussing, and Curtis Davies, who can't even make the bench, even though he's fully fit. So it's been a pretty remarkable journey for him, and he's capped it off with 2 goals in a fortnight against Middlesbrough and now against Stoke.
Yeah, certainly. Another Bruce brainwave. I think that when Harry Maguire signed, the City fans will remember him very well from the day out at Wembley, when he kind of looked as if he was the brightest spark in the Sheffield United team. And I remember the reluctance that they had to actually let him go, particularly for that price tag. So regardless of what does end up happening with Harry Maguire at the end of the season, whether he stays or whether he goes, I know there's a lot of teams that have declared interest in him, is whether what the price that we're going to recoup from him if he does happen to leave, which I certainly hope he doesn't, is going to be certainly much larger than the 2.5 million price tag we bought him for. He's been a fantastic steward, and one of those players who obviously has been playing, or seems extremely experienced for his age, in the amount of games that he's actually played. He's heavily capped, and as he was given the captain's armband the other week against Middlesbrough, just kind of goes to show how much he has come along leaps and bounds under Silva.
Well, certainly, and that point on his age is brilliant because I had a discussion with someone the other week about him versus Michael Keane, who's playing so well for Burnley, and they were saying that Michael Keane was a player who had so much more development to go than Harry Maguire, that Michael Keane was sort of ahead of Maguire in the stakes for England because he was one for the future and it was this long-term project. And I made the point that Harry Maguire was actually younger than Michael Keane, and it's just the fact that Maguire is so developed and he's such a big, bustling sort of player, and he's obviously he played over 100 games for Sheffield United before he even joined us, and so he's been around for quite a while, and he's been this player who sort of looks like he's just this developed player, but he's still only a kid, so he's still got a huge amount of upside in his game, and it's quite remarkable to think what level he can get to if he can continue this sort of development.
Yeah, certainly. And I think that Harry Maguire, if he, as we mentioned a couple of weeks ago, if he doesn't make the international fold in his career now, I think personally it would be somewhat of an underachievement because, as you mentioned, his age and the ability that as City fans have seen, this idea of a passing centre back, he's happy to take defence on, and does have those busting runs. I think that Marco Silva seems to have trimmed him down a little bit, which I know that there was a lot of talk about his nutritional changes when he first came to the club. And so I think that the biggest thing from the nutritional change with Silva was that Tom Huddleston and Harry Maguire as well were the two that seem to have benefited the most. And like we said, Harry looks much slimmer, but still kind of kept that physical presence about himself and seems maybe like his mobility's improved. And it seems to just have suited him down to a T. So I think if we're looking for reasons why Harry Maguire has flourished under Marco Silva, I think that we would have to attribute that to him for sure.
And I guess you've already mentioned the fact that he was made captain against Middlesbrough, and we've talked about ways to sort of entice him to stay at the club. But looking around the team, is there a better candidate to be the long-term captain of the club than Harry Maguire?
Look, I certainly think that Harry Maguire has thrown his name forward admirably, and he would, by no stretch of the imagination, would be a poor choice. I think if there's anybody outside of him, I think the other name that I could probably mention is maybe Sam Klukas. But with that being said, I still think that for a long-term future option, if Hull are to go down that path, and obviously it will depend largely on whether we stay in the Premier League, I think Harry Maguire would be a fantastic fit for Hull, and he's been a great servant in his short time already.
Yeah, I mean, I think a lot of people are treating it as a foregone conclusion that he'll be gone in the summer, but I'm sort of hoping if we are to stay up, and if Silva does stay on as manager for at least one more season, that he would be able to convince Maguire to stay on with him, and really sort of see where he can take the club, because I think Maguire's finally got a manager who has that confidence in him, because Phelan and Bruce never played him to the extent that they put that faith in, say, Robertson, who I've compared him to, because they were both signed around the same time. So I would assume, from Maguire's perception, he never really had that faith from his managers to really sort of throw him in and give him that run of games. He was only ever sort of a stopgap when other players were injured. So I would hope that he sort of repays that faith that Silva's shown in him. But I mean, football's a fickle thing. If he got an offer from a top six club, and he's spoken quite regularly about his ambitions to get into the England squad, he may well see that a move is the best thing he can do for his career.
Yeah, certainly, and I think that it's proven over time that, particularly in our short stints in the Premier League, that Hull City players aren't exactly well looked upon when it comes to making that national selection. So, yeah, as you mentioned, if he does have those national ambitions of playing for his country, then it may end up requiring him to move to a so-called bigger club, which, whilst is very disappointing for a City fan to hear, is probably the reality.
Yeah. Well, we'll move on and we'll discuss the upcoming game against Watford that's being played this weekend. And we've already touched on it a little bit in discussing the situation regarding Swansea, but this certainly is a must-win game, isn't it?
Oh, most definitely. I think that given the magnitude of the situation, knowing that we take 3 points against Watford and 3 points against Sunderland, really takes off the pressure of having to take 3 points on the final day at home against Spurs, if it comes to that, which would be a very tall ask in the form that they're in currently.
I think, yeah, I think the best case scenario for City fans is, I think it's the FA Cup semi-finals this weekend. Best case scenario would be that Spurs can beat Chelsea, but Chelsea can wrap up the title before the final day. So Spurs have their eyes on the FA Cup final, and they're not in the title race. But yeah, I mean that's kind of going a few steps ahead. But focusing on the Watford game, I think 3 points against Watford will definitely keep us in 17th. We'll keep Swansea in 18th. Heaps the pressure on them to win again. So even if, I mean, it would be hugely demoralising for their players that if they were to beat Stoke, but then walk into the dressing rooms and see that we've beaten Watford, so they stay in 18th and they haven't actually improved their position. It kind of I would presume it would be quite damaging for them to sort of look at the table and say, well, it's actually not had any impact at all, and we're right back where we started. So with one less game to play, no less. So they've got United and Everton to come in the next two games as well. So there's a lot of pressure on them to win the game against Stoke. So absolutely, and we have to remember, I mean, when we played Watford last time out, they didn't register a shot on target. So it's not as if Watford are a team that has a great track record against us or dominates us or plays us off the park. So it's certainly a winnable game, particularly with our home form.
Yeah, certainly. And I think that Watford, in the situation they're in, they're not really looking to pick up points or short of finishing in a healthy league position. They're not really playing for all too much. And I think that that will certainly play into our hands coming into this week, knowing that we have it all to play for, and Watford are kind of hopefully going to turn up in cruise mode.
Yeah, absolutely. Based on how we lined up last week against Stoke, can you foresee any changes to the formation? I mean, we've already sort of touched on Maguire being a bit out of position at right back. Do you see either Elmo coming back into the team or maybe switching to a 3-5-2?
I think the biggest one is hopefully Omar Abdullawi will be fit, and if he returns to the squad, I think that will the team will almost pick itself. I think if he's not to, then maybe the option of reinstating Elmo and showing him a bit more confidence, particularly at home, I think will be the other way. So I think it'll be one of those two changes that will take place. But outside of that, I can't really see too much else changing, except for perhaps starting with Hernandez and the Ass up top, as we did against Borough.
So if El Abdullawi was to come into the team, would you see Dawson as the one that drops out of that back four?
Given the form in the last couple of weeks, I think that Dawson would have to be the person. Because you can't really drop Harry Maguire or Ranocchia. And as we mentioned at the top of the podcast, playing the three at the same time hasn't seemed to give us too much luck in recent times. So I think that would be the most sensible option.
And then on the Watford front, I suppose their most dangerous player at the moment is Troy Deeney, who's been in pretty decent form for them. I think he's been involved in a fair few goals in recent games for them. Capu obviously doing us a favour with a goal against Swansea as well. Who do you see as the most dangerous Watford player that we're going to have to contend with?
Yeah, I think as you mentioned, I think Deeney and Capu are the two that are probably the most notables. With that being said, I think that Watford are sitting where they are in the Premier League table, and they're obviously safe for a reason. So, although we would look at it as a huge opportunity to take 3 points, I think we have to be realistic that Watford are quite a squad, and that they are going to cause us a large degree of trouble, regardless of how we set up.
I'm always convinced that Watford have somehow got a squad of 50 players past the Premier League without them noticing it. Because every time I watch Watford play, they seem to have 3 or 4 players in their starting 11 who I've never heard of, and then bring another 2 or 3 off the bench who I've never heard of. So they seem to have this endless rotation of players that they seem to, like their manager, they seem to defy football logic, that they sack their manager every year, they turn over 3/4 of their squad, and yet they somehow keep improving and progressing up the table.
Yeah, that seems to be a common theme. I remember that famous championship promotion year that you mentioned. The amount of loan players that they had that they brought in with their links with Italy, and it was a challenge to pronounce the entire Watford squad. And as you mentioned, they were just kind of they weren't regulars. You didn't really know too much about them, but they just had this endless supply. So. City fans will certainly remember that, as they were the team we spent the most of the final part of the season watching.
And what's your prediction for this game? What's your scoreline?
I think it's a very difficult one. I think that my prediction, I'm going to say, is going to be 1-0 City, but I think that it's going to be very, very tough, and I think it's probably going to be a late goal.
We seem to be pretty attacking at home, and we can score a few goals, so I suspect it might be 2-1. Only because it does seem that we're back to struggling to keep clean sheets. Watford, of course, as I'd said before, that they didn't manage a shot on target against us away from home. So there is every chance it could end up just being a scrappy 1-0. But hopefully, Watford now hitting that 40-point barrier. They've only got 1 win in 9 away games, I believe. So signs are pointing towards chances for a City win, and hopefully one where we can keep a clean sheet and maybe even improve our goal difference a bit. Because if you're looking at the goal difference between us and Swansea, it is one where it may well come into contention towards the end of the season. And I mean, we've gone a while without picking up a draw, but if we were to draw with Watford, it would mean that if Swansea were also to win, that would be level on points. So goal difference may well come into it on the final day. So every chance we can to improve that could well be needed.
Yeah, indeed. And I think that if City are to stay up this season, I think that this is perhaps the most pivotal weekend in the rest of the season. I think that if we are to take 3 points now, and Swansea are to falter at Stoke, then I think that we would be a huge chance of staying up.
Absolutely. So we've got that to look forward to this weekend. So thank you very much for coming on, Logan.
Not a problem.
And thank you everyone for listening in. Just before we head off, I thought I'd let everyone know as a shout out to my beautiful girlfriend Lauren that I proposed to her yesterday. So very much looking forward to all the joys that will bring in the future. So thank you everyone for listening in, and come on City. You've been listening to the official Hull City Australia podcast. For more discussion, join us on Facebook in the Hull City AFC Australian Supporters Group, or follow us on Twitter at Hull City AFC Oz. The music was created by Amber and Black.
There's no turning back 'cause you're out.